In 1750, a man named Jonas Hanway walked through the streets of London carrying an umbrella. He was not the first person in history to carry one. He was, however, the first man in England to carry one in public. And the city of London, one of the wettest, most rain-saturated cities in the Western world, a city that averaged over 150 rainy days per year, responded to the sight of a man protecting himself from rain with the closest thing the 18th century had to a public riot. Coachmen screamed abuse at him from their carriages. Pedestrians stopped to stare and laugh. Street vendors threw things. A hackney cab driver, whose livelihood depended on wealthy passengers needing transportation in wet weather, reportedly chased Hanway down the street shouting threats. Jonas Hanway carried his umbrella through London for 30 years. He was mocked for every single one of them. He did not stop. And by the time he died in 1786, the umbrella had become so embedded in English daily life that London would, within a generation, become the single city most associated with the object on Earth. An association so complete that today, 250 years later, the image of a person in a bowler hat carrying an umbrella is the universal visual shorthand for Britishness itself. The city that threw things at the first man who carried one made the umbrella its national symbol. But the story of how that happened, and why it took so long, and what it cost the people who carried umbrellas before it was acceptable to do so, begins not in England, not in the rain, and not with protection from weather at all. It begins in the desert, under the blazing sun, in the hands of a god. For most of human history, the umbrella had nothing to do with rain. The earliest depictions of umbrella-like objects appear in the art and artifacts of ancient Egypt, Assyria, Persia, and China. Civilizations separated by thousands of miles that arrived independently at the same object for the same reason: shade. In a world without sunscreen, without hats of any reliable construction, without the ability to control your environment in almost any meaningful way, shade was not a comfort. It was a survival tool. And portable shade, shade that moved with you, that you could carry into the open desert, the open field, the open road, was something so valuable that it was immediately understood as a privilege of the highest possible rank. In ancient Assyria, the umbrella appears in stone reliefs dating to roughly 1350 BC. In every single one of those carvings, the umbrella is held over one figure, and one figure only: the king. Not carried by the king, held over the king by a servant, because the act of holding your own umbrella would have implied that no one existed beneath you in the social order whose sole function was to hold it for you. The umbrella, in the ancient world, was not an object. It was a declaration. It said, "I am the kind of person the sun does not touch." In ancient Egypt, pharaohs were depicted beneath canopies and fan-like shade structures carried by attendants. In Persia, the royal umbrella, the chhatra, was one of the most sacred symbols of kingship, appearing in court ceremonies, diplomatic processions, and military parades as a visual marker of absolute authority. In ancient China, imperial umbrellas were constructed in multiple tiers. The more tiers, the higher the rank of the person beneath them. The emperor traveled under 4 tiers, provincial governors under 2. A commoner carrying a tiered umbrella would have been committing something close to treason. This is the object Jonas Hanway carried through the streets of London in 1750. Not a piece of weather equipment, a throne made portable. And the reason London's coachmen threw things at him had less to do with the rain than with what the umbrella had always meant, and who it had always meant it for. The umbrella reached Europe through trade routes from Persia and China, arriving first in Italy and France in the 16th century. And it arrived, true to its entire history, as an object for women. Specifically, for aristocratic women being carried in litters and sedan chairs who needed protection from sun on their skin, because pale skin in the 16th century signaled that you did not work outdoors, which signaled wealth, which signaled status. The parasol, from the Italian para, to shield, and sol, sun, was a feminine aristocratic accessory. Small, decorative, often silk, usually held by a servant, and understood by everyone who saw it as a marker of femininity and elevated social rank. It was emphatically not a masculine object. Which is why, when Jonas Hanway picked one up in 1750 and carried it through London in the rain, the reaction was not merely amusement. It was something closer to offense. A man carrying an umbrella in 18th century London was doing at least 3 things simultaneously that his society found intolerable. He was carrying an object coded as feminine. He was implying that he could not afford a sedan chair or a carriage, the rain protection options available to men of means. And he was refusing to simply get wet, which English masculine culture had decided was the correct response to English weather. Getting wet was stoic. Getting wet was manly. Carrying a silk shade device imported from the continent was none of those things. The coachmen who chased Hanway down the street were not merely defending their income. They were defending a social order that the umbrella, in the wrong hands, quietly threatened to undermine. But Hanway was about to be joined by a force the coachmen could not chase down the street: the Industrial Revolution. Here is what the Industrial Revolution did to the umbrella that no amount of social acceptance could have accomplished on its own. It made it cheap enough for everyone. Before the 19th century, umbrellas were constructed from whalebone or cane frames covered in oiled silk, expensive materials, assembled by hand, producing an object that cost roughly the equivalent of a week's wages for a working man. They were also enormous, heavy, and awkward. Early models weighed several pounds and required genuine physical effort to carry for any extended period. In 1852, a London engineer named Samuel Fox invented the steel-ribbed umbrella frame, replacing whalebone with thin, strong steel wire that was lighter, cheaper, and far more durable than anything previously available. The price collapsed, the weight dropped, the reliability increased, and the umbrella became, almost overnight, a mass-market object available to every income level in a way it had never been in its 3,000-year history. But there was a second force driving adoption that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with a shift in who was walking. As the Industrial Revolution moved millions of workers from fields into factories, from rural communities into cities, the daily experience of being caught in rain without transportation became universal. A factory worker in Manchester or Birmingham could not afford a carriage, could not call a sedan chair, walked to work, walked home, walked to market, walked everywhere, in a climate that rained without apology for roughly half the year. The umbrella did not just offer protection from rain, it offered factory workers, shop girls, and office clerks the same protection from weather that god kings had reserved exclusively for themselves for 3,000 years. Portable shade, portable shelter, democratized in the span of one generation. And the social stigma that had clung to the umbrella for a century in England did not survive the moment a million working people decided they were cold and wet and no longer cared what the coachmen thought. The coachmen, for their part, lost their argument and their livelihood in the same decade. But the umbrella's journey was not simply one of practical adoption smoothed by falling prices. Because at precisely the moment the umbrella was becoming universally accepted in Europe and America, it was developing a second life, one that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with power, identity, and the surprising way a simple object can become the emblem of an entire civilization's self-image. The British Empire, at its 19th century peak, governed roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface. Its administrators, diplomats, military officers, and colonial officials traveled to every climate on Earth: tropical heat, desert sun, monsoon rain, and they carried with remarkable consistency a tightly furled black umbrella. Not always open, often simply carried. Not for the rain, never for the rain. The furled umbrella became, in the hands of the British colonial administrator, something with an almost absurd symbolic weight. It communicated control. It said, "I come from a place so confident in its own order that I carry an instrument of civilized weather management into environments that have no use for it." It was a flag, a portable declaration of cultural identity so recognizable that a cartoon drawn anywhere in the world could establish a character as British simply by putting a furled black umbrella in their hand. Explorers carried them into jungles. Diplomats carried them into rooms where the sun had never once been a problem. Officers carried them to the edges of deserts where rain had not fallen in living memory. The object that began as a symbol of divine untouchability, held over kings so the sun would know its place, had completed a 3,000-year journey and arrived once again as a symbol of untouchability. Different empire, same declaration. I am the kind of person the weather does not inconvenience. Today, over 1 billion umbrellas are manufactured every year. The global market is valued at over $7 billion. They are carried in Tokyo subway stations and Mumbai monsoons, and Manhattan rainstorms and Nairobi afternoons by people who have never thought twice about the object in their hand and what it cost historically to make it ordinary. The anti-UV parasol, the direct descendant of the shade device held over Assyrian kings 3,000 years ago, is now one of the fastest growing product categories in Asian consumer markets. The object has come full circle, from sun to rain and back to sun, from the hand of a god king to the hand of every commuter on Earth. You have probably lost 3 of them on public transport without noticing. That is how thoroughly Jonas Hanway won. The man who walked through London for 30 years absorbing mockery, threats, and thrown objects, who never had a corporation behind him, never had a government mandate, never had anything except the quiet, stubborn conviction that getting unnecessarily wet was a problem worth solving. That man won so completely that the city which humiliated him for 3 decades made his object its identity. The coachman who chased him down the street was protecting a world where weather separated the powerful from the powerless, where the rain fell on everyone it was permitted to fall on, and the people with enough rank, enough money, enough servants, they stayed dry. Jonas Hanway decided that was not a law of nature. It was just an arrangement nobody had bothered to challenge yet. He challenged it, alone, in the rain, for 30 years. The next time you open an umbrella without thinking, without gratitude, without ceremony, without any awareness whatsoever that you are holding 3,000 years of human hierarchy collapsed into a spring-loaded canopy that costs $8. Remember that the first person who did what you just did was chased down a street for it, and he kept walking.